Everyone laughed when the cowboy paid $2 for the too fat mail-order bride. But tell me this, what kind of wound cuts deeper
Too
than
fat.
being mocked as worthless in front of an entire town? What kind of scars remain when a woman is told she is too broken, too heavy, too unworthy to ever be loved? And yet, what if the very woman they laughed at that morning was the one who saved his life that night? Would her story still end in shame or in a love no one believed possible? Stay with me because this is the untold journey of Clara, a journey from humiliation to hope, from rejection to redemption. The noon sun over Dry Creek made the dust look like smoke from a slow-burning fire. The depot boards were warm underfoot, and the wind dragged little torn flyers along like wounded birds. A bell rang. Men took off their hats not out of respect, but so they could lean in closer to look. Clara stood with her suitcase latched and both hands folded over the handle. 50 years will teach a body how to stand without swaying, how to keep a face still when the world goes mean. She wore a dark blue dress that fit the way a lighthouse fits a cliff, sturdy, unpretty, unmovable. Her shoulders were broad, her hips generous, her hands squared by years of work that had fed other people more often than herself. Next called the station man, clearing his throat like a judge about to sentence. Letters say, "Good cook keeps a clean house, knows her hymns. Comes willing, fair-minded disposition." He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Faces already turned, and some of them turned twice like they had to make sure the size of her was no trick of the light. A boy laughed, then a man. The sound traveled easy as wind through grass. Too fat of her, someone said loud enough to be heard, soft enough to be denied. Two of her, another added, and a little ripple of laughter ran to the end of the platform and back. Clara let her eyes rest on the far hills. She had learned that as a young wife to a man who liked a quiet table, and a smaller woman looked past the sting. He'd married her because his sister said Clara was dutiful. He'd left because duty isn't much of a sport. When he went, he took tenderness with him like it was a horse he owned. After that, the years had done what years will do. Her body remembered every thin winter, every shift on her feet, every long walk home. It had become a house with thick walls and a wide hearth, useful but seldom praised. The station man knocked on the counter to wake the silence. "Bride fees $2 for the paper and the preacher's time," he repeated. "We aren't haggling folks here. You want the lady, you show respect. Step forward." A few men shook their heads as if the price were the insult. Most drifted off, tugged by the saloon or the idea of a smaller hand on their arm. Clara pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth and willed her heartbeat to hollow out its sound. She could leave. She could take her suitcase down the long road and let the prairie keep her. She could thin into silence like smoke. She had done it before in other places, where there was no audience, just a closed door and a bed that didn't notice when you cried. The crowd parted without ceremony, and a big-shouldered cowboy stepped through, hat pulled, low dust on his boots up to the ankles. Thomas had the kind of quiet that made noise nervous. He put his hat under his arm and looked at Clara as if she were the only thing in the yard worth counting right. He didn't glance down, didn't weigh her with his eyes, didn't work out how many mouths she might mean. He just nodded once like a man who'd found water. "I'm Thomas," he said. The voice had gravel in it and comfort. "Afternoon, ma'am," Clara swallowed. "Afternoon." The station man cleared his throat again. $2, he prompted. Thomas took a leather pouch from his pocket, thumbed it once, and set down $2 silver on the counter with a sound like two small doors shutting. Heads turned. Someone snorted. "That all she's worth?" a thin voice needled from the back. Thomas didn't turn. "That's the fee for paper," he said, even and low. "She's not for sale." A few men laughed anyway, spite softening their spines. The station man scribbled, slid a form across, and reached for a pen that had lost more feathers than it had ink. Clara found herself studying Thomas's hands. Square, capable, a nick on the thumb, a half-moon of dirt under one nail he'd missed. Not pretty hands, reliable ones, the kind that remember how to be gentle after a hard day. "You don't know me," she said. She could keep her voice steady when the floor tipped. She had practice. "No, ma'am," Thomas said. "But I can try." The wind came in off the plains and lifted the edge of her shawl. Somebody coughed the word cow into his palm and smiled like he'd built a church. The station man pushed the paper toward Thomas for a signature, then toward Clara. She didn't move. Or we can walk away. Thomas added as if walking away didn't also bruise. You owe no one nothing. Clara's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle, and the old ache in her wrists woke like a dog pricking its ears. Her mind offered her the picture of the boarding house she left behind, rooms stacked with other people's grief, a bed that smelled like bleach and winter breath, a landlady whose eyes skimmed Clara's body like she was reading a tax list. Then it offered her a different image, a table with 4 plates and lamplight, the sound of a gate closing softly, the sight of a man coming in tired and glad there was a home to come into. Ma'am, Thomas said again, but this time he said it like a question he would accept either answer to. Clara set down her suitcase. The sound it made was not much, but it carried. She took the pen. Her hand made its way through the loops of her name, like a woman wading a slow river. Thank you, she whispered, not sure who she said it to, God, or the man beside her, or the part of herself that refused to be small. Reckon you'll be wanting the preacher, the station man said, already bored with the shape of other people's futures. He's out to the edge of town tacking up his fence. He grinned at Thomas. You can get vows and fence advice in one go. More laughter. It sounded like tin pans dropped on a hard floor. Thomas put his hat back on. We'll see the preacher, he said, and the way he said, we made something in Clara's chest loosen a notch. He picked up her suitcase with a care better men had not shown more delicate things. They walked toward the wagon. No one offered congratulations. A few women watched them with narrowed eyes, tallying Clara's waist against their own. One old man touched the brim of his hat as if to remind himself his head was still there. At the hitch rail, Thomas set the suitcase in the back and held out a hand. Not the kind of hand that pulls, the kind that waits. Clara put her palm in it and felt for the first time in a season of years that the ground would allow her weight. You'll ride up front, Thomas said. If you please. Clara's mouth tilted, half a smile that hadn't been used in a long while. If you please, she echoed. They rode out under a sky too big to be owned by anybody. The wagon creaked. The mules swayed with a patience that only animals and old women share. For a time they didn't speak. The plane said enough. It said things live out here that don't make a sound until they have to. Got a small spread, Thomas said at last. South fence wants mending. North pasture'll hold if we get rain. House stays warm if you don't ask it for anything fancy. I keep beans, coffee, sometimes bacon. My hands come by once a week. Most days it's just me. Just you, Clara said. The words felt softer in her mouth than they sounded in hers. I lost somebody, Thomas added after a stretch eyes on the road. A good long time ago. I keep it where it belongs now. But it taught me things, like how quiet can turn on a person if nobody else lives in it. Clara let that sit where he'd put it. She knew about quiet. She knew the way it can feel like kindness, right up until it doesn't. Folks in town, Thomas said after a while, they talk. That's a thing they can keep if they like. Up on my land, the wind takes words out of a mouth and throws them to the sage. I've found I don't miss them. You paid $2, Clara said. The sentence surprised her like a note struck on an instrument she hadn't touched in years. They laughed. Thomas nodded once. $2 buys paper. It doesn't buy people. Clara turned her head toward him. The light caught the fine lines at the corners of his eyes the way a life catches in a man. She thought about the last time a man had said anything kind to her. She couldn't number the years. She could number the sentences. There were not many. By the time they reached the preacher's place, the light had peeled off the day like old paint. The preacher stood with a hammer convincing a fence post to stay upright. He didn't blink at the sight of them. He didn't ask how long they'd known each other or if she could bake. He wiped his hands and said the words that are always truer than the people who speak them know how to be. Do you intend to keep this woman as your wife? Yes. Thomas didn't make it a speech. Do you intend to keep this man as your husband? Clara looked past the preacher at the fence line. One post had a fracture down the middle, a lightning scar of old weather. Someone had bound it with iron. It held. She raised her eyes to Thomas. He stood still, not braced for triumph or escape, just available to the future. Yes, she said, and in the saying felt the smallest door in her open, and a draft of something clean slipped through. The preacher smiled like a man satisfied with his day's work. There you are, he said. Keep your fence lines true and your temper short. He shook their hands and went back to his hammer. On the road home, the wind got up and worried the grass. Thomas set his jaw like a man listening to weather that wasn't in the sky. The mules picked up a nervous step. Storm Clara asked. Maybe Thomas said. Their sign. Clara lifted her face. The air had turned metallic like the breath before lightning. She folded her shawl close around her and kept her eyes on the line where the land met itself. In town, they had laughed at a price. Out here, the price of anything could be counted more dearly: light, warmth, a voice moving across a small room. The first drop hit the back of Thomas's hand. He didn't flinch. We'll be in before it breaks, he said. And the way he said we again steadied her like her palm on the rail of a good stair. They reached the house with the rain just beginning to stitch the dust into dark thread. Thomas swung down, lifted her suitcase, then offered both hands and set her to the ground as though she were new glass. He unlatched the door and the smell of dry wood welcomed them, the way a dog greets a traveler, no questions, all relief. I'll bring in the stock, he said. You light the lamp on the table and put water on, if you don't mind. I don't, she said. He went back out into the moving gray, and she made a small home out of the next few minutes, lamp-lit kettle on a pan set ready. The room took her shape without complaint. On the mantel, a single-frame photograph faced the wall. She did not turn it. She understood that some griefs prefer to be left with their backs showing. The door blew open, and Thomas shouldered his way in, wet to the brim of his hat. Storm will walk heavy, he said, stripping off his coat and shaking water onto the thirsty floor. We'll ride it out. A light cracked somewhere close enough to be heard, far enough not to feel. The kettle began to murmur. The house settled its bones. Clara wrapped her hands around the teacup and listened to the storm find its voice. People had laughed at noon. By nightfall, the wind had other plans for this house and for the two people learning how to say we inside it. And before the lamp burned low, the first of those plans would require Clara to choose between the old silence and the new courage. The kind of choice that makes a life turn on a dime or a prayer. Would the woman they called $2 be the only one with enough worth to keep a man living through the night? The storm came down from the mountains with the speed of a galloping horse. The air grew sharp, filled with the scent of iron and wet earth. By the time the first crack of thunder split the sky, Thomas had already braced the shutters and checked the barn doors twice. Inside, Clara stood by the lamplight, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The flame flickered as if it too was afraid of the wind clawing at the house. She had weathered storms before, but this was different. She wasn't in a boarding house with thin walls and strangers anymore. She wasn't alone in a rented bed where no one cared if she woke the next day. Here in this rough ranch house, she belonged to something, even if only in name. She placed bread and beans on the table. Her hands trembled not from the thunder, but from the quiet presence of Thomas as he moved about the room, steady, deliberate. He was not a man who wasted words. His silence was not cruelty. It was shelter. When the lightning struck again, nearer this time, Clara flinched. The sound dragged her back to memories she had buried, nights when her first husband slammed doors in fits of anger, nights when she learned to curl herself small and invisible. She shook her head, trying to cast it off, but the storm outside had awakened storms within. Scared, Thomas asked gently, noticing her grip on the table's edge. No, she said quickly, too quickly. Then softer, yes. But it's not the thunder. He paused, hat in hand, his gaze holding hers. There was no judgment there, only understanding. I know the kind of storms that come from the inside, he said quietly. Sometimes worse than anything the sky can throw. Her eyes widened. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her like that, as though her silence had always carried a story. The storm battered the house all night, but it was not thunder that made Clara's heart race. It was the way Thomas simply sat at the table sipping coffee, not demanding words, not demanding more than she could give. He was present in a way no man had ever been for her. When dawn broke, the storm was gone, leaving the world scrubbed raw and bright. Clara stepped outside and found the air clean, the grass glistening. Thomas was already in the yard, checking fences, his shoulders squared against the morning sun. For the first time in years, Clara felt something stir inside her. Not hope yet, that was too fragile, but perhaps the faintest echo of it. She touched the doorway, steadying herself, and whispered, "Maybe this house could hold me." Inside, the kettle hissed as if answering back. But storms never vanish without leaving scars. and Clara's past long buried was about to return with claws sharper than thunder. Clara had thought the storm had passed. The skies were clear, the fences mended, and the boys, Thomas's two nephews who often stayed on the ranch, were laughing in the barn. The house smelled of fresh bread, a gift from Clara's hands, and for a brief moment she believed peace had finally settled over her life. But shadows travel faster than light, and hers found her before long. It was a Sunday afternoon when she heard the sound of horses in the distance. Clara was sweeping the porch when she saw them, three riders men. She had known once men who had branded her with cruel laughter long before she ever set foot on this ranch. They were ranch hands from her first husband's circle men who had seen her stumble on her bad leg, and jeered men who had said she wasn't worth the space she took up. They pulled up their horses at the gate, dust rising around them. One tipped his hat mockingly. "Well, if it ain't Clara," he sneered. "Heard you were sold for $2. Looks like even that was a bargain." Her hand tightened around the broomstick, but she said nothing. The silence was heavy, choking. Thomas stepped out, then broad shoulders filling the doorway. His gaze was steady, unflinching. "State your business," he said flatly. The men chuckled. "Just checking on our old friend. Didn't think anyone would take her in, let alone a rancher like you. Don't you know she's broken goods?" The words struck Clara like stone's words she had carried all her life. But before they could settle into her bones again, Thomas's voice cut through the air, deep and sure. "You're wrong," he said simply. "She's the strongest woman I've ever known." The laughter faltered. One of the men spat into the dirt, muttered something under his breath, and they rode off. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had expected Thomas to ignore the insult, or worse, to let it stand, but he hadn't. He had defended her not with rage, not with violence, but with quiet truth. Inside, she put the broom down and sat heavily at the table. Her hands trembled. "You don't know me," she whispered when Thomas came in. "You don't know what I've been through. They were right. I'm not worth—" "Stop," he said firmly, but not unkindly. He sat across from her, meeting her tearful eyes. "I don't need to know every detail of your past to know your worth. You're here. You're standing. That's enough." Her chest ached with a strange, painful warmth. No one had ever spoken to her like that. For years she had carried the words of cruel men as though they were scripture, letting them define her. And now Thomas's words struck against them, like flint sparking something deep within. Still the conflict raged inside her. Could she believe him? Could she truly let go of the shadows that clung to her? Or would her past always return to remind her she was less than? That night Clara lay awake, listening to the wind against the eaves. The words of the ranch hands echoed in her ears, but so did Thomas's voice. "Strongest woman I've ever known." Two truths wrestled inside her. One would break her. The other might just set her free. The prairie night was long and unkind. Clara lay in her narrow bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Outside, the coyotes called, the wind pressed its cold breath against the walls, and inside her chest, two voices battled like fire and ash. "You're broken goods," the old voices hissed the men at the gate. Her first husband, her own family, when they'd said, "No man will ever want you, Clara." Those words were carved into her like brands. But another voice, quieter, steadier, echoed too. "She's the strongest woman I've ever known." Thomas's voice spoken not as pity, but as truth. For hours she lay trembling between those two verdicts. The next morning, Clara forced herself to rise before the others. She went out to the corral, the broom still in her hand, as though ready to face the world with nothing but stubbornness. She watched the horses stamping in the cold dirt, their breath rising like smoke. One horse, an old mare with a scarred flank, limped heavily, favoring one leg. Clara froze. The mare's limp was like a mirror of her own. Years of stumbling, mocked by men, the limp she had carried since childhood. And yet here the mare stood strong, alive, still carrying her weight despite her wound. Clara's hand pressed against her chest. For the first time she whispered aloud into the empty air, "Maybe broken doesn't mean useless." Later that day, Thomas returned from town weary but calm. He found Clara kneeling by the hearth, helping his young nephews with their letters. The boys' heads bent close to hers, laughter spilling as she gently corrected their spelling. Thomas stood in the doorway, longer than he should have, watching. He wasn't looking at a limping girl. He was looking at a woman who carried pain, but poured out patience, who had been crushed, but still gave kindness. When the boys left, Thomas lingered. "Clara," he said softly. She looked up, her hands tightening on the threadbare cloth in her lap. "Why do you stay?" she asked suddenly. "You could have chosen anyone. Why keep me here when the whole town laughs at you for it?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, the lamplight sharpening the lines of his face. "I don't hear the laughter," he said finally. "I hear my heart. And it tells me I'd rather have one honest, brave woman beside me than 100 cowards who only look the part." Clara swallowed hard, her throat aching. "But I limp. I'm scarred." "I, you live," he interrupted gently but firmly, "and that's more than most can say." That night when the household was asleep, Clara stepped outside. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stood under the Montana stars. The vast sky stretched above her, endless and quiet. For so long she had felt like a ghost among the living. But here, with Thomas's words still warming her, she felt present. She knelt in the dirt, pressed her hand to the ground, and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared in years. "God, if there is more for me than pain, show me. If there is a place where I can belong, let me see it." And the wind, instead of howling, seemed to soften, brushing her cheek like an answer. The next day brought no miracles, but it brought something better: resolve. Clara rose with a straighter back. She fed the chickens baked bread, and when she heard whispers in town later that week, she no longer shrank. The cruel words were still sharp, but she carried Thomas's truth like a shield. The struggle wasn't over, but for the first time Clara was fighting with herself instead of against herself. The silence she had lived in for 50 years was beginning to break. The thaw of spring came late that year, as though winter didn't want to release its grip on Montana. Snowmelt turned the dirt roads to rivers of mud, and every hoofstep sank deep. Clara felt the weight of the land pressing on her chest each morning, yet she met it with quiet resolve. For weeks she had lived beneath Thomas's roof, no longer a stranger, but not yet family either. But peace, she knew, was fragile, and it would be tested. One Sunday, Thomas took Clara and the boys into town. The church bells rang, calling ranchers, widows, and drifters alike. Clara wore her plain shawl, head bowed. She would have preferred to stay home, but Thomas insisted gently, "You belong there as much as anyone." At first, all she felt were eyes, dozens of them. Some slid over her body with scorn, others whispered behind gloved hands. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. Thomas's steady stride at her side was the only thing that kept her upright. Then came the cruel spark. At the church steps, a rancher's wife, tall and sharp as a blade, leaned toward her companion and said just loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Imagine $2 for that. I wouldn't pay 2 cents." Laughter rippled like a whip across Clara's skin. She froze, her heart thudding painfully. It was the same ridicule she had endured since girlhood, now resurrected like a ghost she couldn't bury. The boys stiffened, fists clenched. Thomas turned slowly, his face hardening into stone. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply placed a firm arm around Clara's shoulders and said clearly for every ear to hear, "I'd pay every penny I have for her again and more. She's worth more than all your fine ribbons and wagons combined." Silence fell. The rancher's wife paled. But Clara, her body trembled, not from shame this time, but from something entirely new. The shock of being defended, truly defended, as though she mattered. That night back at the ranch, Clara wept quietly by the fire. Thomas found her there, her face hidden in her hands. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered. "Now they'll only laugh harder at you." Thomas sat down across from her, his voice low but steady. "Let them laugh. They've never known what it's like to be hungry or alone or desperate. You have, and you survived. That makes you stronger than all of them put together." Clara shook her head. "You see me as strong, Thomas, but all I've ever felt is less. Less than other women. Less than what a wife should be. Less than what a man could want." His gaze softened. He reached across, taking her work-worn hands into his. "Clara, the world may have called you less, but to me you're more. More patient, more steady, more real than any I've known. And I'd rather have your less than anyone else's more." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that. But just as her heart began to open, life struck hard. A week later, Thomas fell ill. A fever raged through him, leaving him weak, bedridden, and half delirious. The boys panicked, not knowing what to do. Clara alone stood steady. She brewed bitter herbs, bathed his burning skin, whispered to him through the night. One stormy evening, Thomas's fever spiked. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale as ash. The doctor in town couldn't come through the flooded roads. Clara sat by his bed, clutching his hand, terror gnawing at her. And then came the voices again, the cruel echoes of her past. He paid only $2 for you? You're worthless. No man would want you. You're nothing but a burden. Clara's chest heaved. For a moment she believed them. She almost let go of his hand. But then she saw his boy's two young faces, staring at her with pleading eyes, looking not at a burden, but at the only anchor they had left. And she remembered Thomas's words, "You're more." Clara rose. She took command of the house that night, as though she had been preparing her whole life for this moment. She boiled water, forced broth between his lips, prayed aloud until her voice broke. And when the fever finally broke at dawn, Thomas's eyes fluttered open. The first word he whispered was not her name. It was one word, hoarse but sure. Stay. Clara's tears fell freely onto his hand. She had saved his life not with beauty, not with wealth, but with courage, endurance, and love. That morning, Clara walked outside into the pale light. The land stretched wide, the hills shining after the rain. For the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger on it. She felt rooted. The trial had passed, and she had not been found wanting. The fever passed, but its echo lingered. For days, Thomas lay weak, drifting in and out of sleep. And through every long night, it was Clara who sat by his side, steady as the mountains outside their window. It was in those hushed hours when the boys were asleep and the fire had burned low that Clara's inner war truly began. She had proven her strength in the crisis. She had fought death back with her hands, her voice, her very will. But now, when Thomas's life was no longer in danger, she faced the harder question. Would she dare believe she was worthy of love? One evening, Thomas called her name, his voice still hoarse but stronger than before. Clara, come sit. She obeyed, perching on the edge of his bed. His eyes, once dulled with fever, now burned with a steady light. He studied her face as though it held the whole truth of the world. You saved me, he said simply. Clara shook her head, embarrassed. No, Thomas. It was the broth, the herbs. The fever broke on its own. But Thomas only smiled faintly. Clara, I know my body. The fever would have taken me if you hadn't stayed. You carried me through. Her throat tightened. Praise was harder to bear than ridicule. She could endure insults, they were familiar. But kindness left her defenseless. Thomas's hand reached for hers. His skin was rough, calloused, yet warm. Clara, he whispered, I've lived through storms, through loss, through hunger, but nothing steadied me more than knowing you were here. She pulled back, startled, her heart hammering. Don't say such things, Thomas. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, he replied, voice firm, though his body was weak. You are not a burden. You are not a price I paid. You are my partner. Clara turned away, staring into the shadows. Memories surged, her husband's cold dismissals, her family's cruel laughter, the whispers at the station, words that had chained her spirit for decades. Too fat, too plain, too useless. I'm none of the things a wife should be, she murmured. Not beautiful, not graceful. People laugh when they see me at your side. Don't you hear them? Don't you care? Silence stretched between them. Then Thomas's voice broke it, steady as a drumbeat. Let them laugh. The world has always mocked what it doesn't understand. But I see you, Clara. I see the woman who mended my children's clothes, who filled this house with warmth, who held my hand when death was near. I see the woman who made me believe I could live again. That's beauty. That's grace. Her breath caught. Tears brimmed, but the chains still clung. That night after he slept, Clara stepped outside. The moonlight spilled over the prairie, silvering the grass. She wrapped her shawl tighter, fighting the wind and the voice inside her that whispered she would never be enough. Then came a soft sound behind her. Little Luke, his blanket trailing, stood in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his eyes half closed with sleep. He rubbed them and whispered, Mama, come inside. Papa needs you. Clara froze. Mama! The word rolled over her like thunder, But instead of fear, it carried a strange peace. She knelt, opening her arms, and the boy stumbled into them, bearing his face in her shawl. In that small, innocent act, something broke. The chains of old shame tightened over 50 years cracked. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of release. She carried Luke back to bed, tucked him in, and sat beside him until he slept. And in the silence of that room, she whispered to herself the truth she had never dared speak: I am not less. I am loved. The next morning, Clara entered the kitchen early, her steps steady, her shoulders no longer bowed. She brewed coffee, baked bread, and set the table. When Thomas shuffled in weak but upright, he stopped short at the sight of her. She looked at him, her eyes clear, her voice firm. Thomas, she said, I won't hide anymore. If you truly mean what you said, that I am your partner, then I'll stand with you. Let the world laugh. I won't bend to them again. For a moment, Thomas simply stared. Then slowly a smile spread across his face, wide and radiant despite his pallor. That's all I ever wanted, Clara. For you to see what I've seen all along. The boys, sensing the shift, came barreling into the kitchen. Caleb wrapped his arms around Clara's waist. Luke grabbed her hand. And as Thomas lowered himself into his chair, the house seemed to hum with a new kind of warmth, no longer fragile but rooted strong. That night under the stars, Clara and Thomas sat side by side. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean against him, resting her head on his shoulder. His arm came around her, naturally steady as the earth beneath their feet. No words were needed. The chains were broken. Clara had released the lies of her past, and in their place bloomed something fierce and gentle belonging. She was no longer a woman mocked for $2. She was no longer abandoned or unwanted. She was Clara, and she was home. Spring swept across the Montana plains like a blessing. Snow melted into rushing streams, and wildflowers stretched their faces to the sun. For the first time in many years, Clara felt as though her own spirit was blooming, unfurling petals she had kept hidden through decades of cold seasons. Each morning began the same way. She stirred porridge on the stove, while Caleb fetched wood, and Luke polished his boots with exaggerated seriousness. Thomas would emerge from his room, still moving slower than before the fever, but growing stronger each day. And there around that wooden table, Clara no longer sat as a guest. She sat as part of a family. One Sunday they rode into town together. The same townsfolk who once laughed when Thomas had paid $2 for the limping woman now stared in silence. Clara's back was straight, her chin high. She held Luke's small hand in hers while Caleb walked proudly at her other side. Thomas stayed close, his hand brushing her arm as if reminding her, "You are not alone." At the general store, a man muttered under his breath, "There goes the fat one." Clara's heart clenched, but before she could react, Caleb's voice rang out sharp and clear. "She's my mama. Don't talk about her like that." The store fell silent. Clara turned to him, eyes wide, and for the first time, the weight of years of mockery began to lift, not because the words stopped, but because she was no longer carrying them alone. Thomas met her gaze, steady and calm. "I told you, Clara," he whispered as they left, "the world can sneer all it wants. But we know who you are." That evening, Clara stood in the yard while the boys played tag among the budding apple trees. Thomas came to her side, his hat in hand. The setting sun painted his face with hues of gold and rose. "Clara," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "when I bought you at that auction, I thought I was just buying a helping hand, someone to cook meals, mend clothes, and keep the boys from growing wild." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "But what I got was the heart I'd been missing. What I got was a woman brave enough to carry me through sickness, strong enough to raise boys who aren't her own, gentle enough to turn a house into a home." Clara's lips trembled. She had dreamed of words like these, but never dared believe she would hear them. "And what of love, Thomas?" she whispered. "Do you speak of that too, or only gratitude?" He stepped closer, placing his rough, weathered hand against her cheek. "Gratitude fades, Clara, but love grows. I love you, not despite who you are, but because of it, because you are Clara, and you are mine if you'll have me." Her heart swelled until she thought it might burst. For the first time in 50 years, she did not doubt. She did not shrink. She did not hide. She lifted her face to his, tears mingling with her smile. "I am yours, Thomas," she said. "Not for $2, not for a promise, but for life." The boys cheered when they saw Thomas wrap his coat around Clara, and hold her close beneath the setting sun. Their laughter echoed across the hills, mingling with the call of meadowlarks and the rush of spring wind. Clara closed her eyes, breathing deeply. She was no longer the limping girl laughed at in the dust of an auction. She was a wife, a mother, a woman cherished not for her beauty, but for her strength, her kindness, her heart. And as night fell, she whispered a prayer into the wind. Let the world laugh if it must. We have love, and that is enough. In the end, Clara's story reminds us of a truth often overlooked. Sometimes the very thing the world mocks is the very thing that saves a life. What others saw as weakness became her strength. What others dismissed as too fat became exactly enough. We all carry scars, some are visible, others buried deep. And yet, like Clara, we are not defined by the laughter of the crowd or the cruelty of careless words. We are defined by the choices we make when life tests us and by the quiet love we give and receive. If you've ever felt overlooked, doubted, or left behind, may Clara's journey remind you that healing is possible even late in life, and that sometimes love finds us when we least expect it, often not in grand gestures, but in small acts of courage, kindness, and faith. This is the spirit of None. Wild West saga stories that heal, stories that remind us of the value of every soul, no matter how bruised. So if Clara's story touched you, please consider subscribing to this channel, sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of hope, and leaving your thoughts below. Do you want to see the next chapter of her life, or hear more stories like this where redemption and love bloom on the rugged frontier? Your voice matters, and your story might inspire the next tale we tell.